Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to a special Krasno event. It is a special event about Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, who passed away at the age of 91. It is an event about Gorbachev's politics, his life, and his legacy. As always, this event will be uploaded to our famous YouTube channel, that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you all for joining us. We have a very international audience today, and you can submit your questions in writing via the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants will select the questions, summarize them perhaps a little bit, and then read them out aloud. Our special guest today is Ambassador Jack Matlock, who knew Gorbachev well, and in later years, they became good friends. Jack Matlock worked for the State Department and the National Security Council during one of the most tumultuous years of the Cold War. He was at the Moscow embassy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and translated many of the letters and documents which went back and forth between Moscow and Washington. In the 1960s and 1970s, Jack Matlock worked as a Soviet expert at the State Department and in the Soviet Union as an American diplomat. In 1974, Jack Matlock was deputy ambassador in Moscow, and in 1981, he became acting ambassador at the US Embassy in Moscow. Then he became ambassador to Czechoslovakia, and from 1987 to 1991, Jack Matlock was US ambassador to the Soviet Union. Jack Matlock participated in all but one of the many summit meetings between the United States and the Soviet Union between 1972 and 1991. And he got to know Gorbachev very well, including on a personal level. Gorbachev, for example, visited him in Greensboro, North Carolina in 2004, where Ambassador Matlock lived at the time. Jack Matlock wrote a number of well-regarded books, including one entitled Reagan and Gorbachev: How the Cold War Ended. Ambassador Matlock, thank you for finding the time to talk to us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Great to have you here. It's not your first appearance at the Krasno Global Event series. You have been here 3 times before, so it's great, always great to have you.
Sorry I can't be there in person.
Yes, it's a shame, but better by Zoom than nothing at all. And let me ask you, you must be very sad about Mikhail Gorbachev's passing. When did you last see him or hear from him?
Well, I last saw him about 2 years ago. And at that point, he was in very poor health. So that I think his final years were not comfortable. But yes, we had developed, I think, a very good personal relationship. And I had been very much impressed by what he was able to achieve when he was president. And then I interviewed him once or twice a year for several years after that, when I was working on my books, including the one that you mentioned. He was always very open to discussing the attitudes in the past and so on. And I think that certainly I benefited greatly from being able to present also his perceptions of things as they developed during this period when we ended the Cold War and communist rule in the Soviet Union was removed. I think some of the most important things that happened during the 20th century.
Yeah, what would you say are his greatest achievements? George Kennan, another Soviet expert, spoke about a miracle which Gorbachev performed during his 7 years in office.
Well, in many ways it was. First of all, he reoriented Soviet foreign policy and internal policy to remove it from a basis on Marxism, Leninism, and the international class struggle. And actually, when you think about it, the whole Cold War was based upon you might say, the Marxist philosophy that history was driven by class struggle and that the proletariat would replace the bourgeoisie and create a dictatorship of the proletariat. That had been the basis of Soviet foreign and internal policy until Gorbachev, and he was able to change that. And therefore, that really permitted us to negotiate it into the Cold War. An end that did not, there had no losers. We ended the Cold War in the interest of all of our countries, and it was done by negotiation and not by defeating one side or the other. The perception that since then that we, United States or the West, won the Cold War and the Soviet Union was defeated is absolutely wrong. That's one thing. The second thing is he moved as we reduced the arms races, reduced the tensions between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. He began to try to reform the system at home. It was a totalitarian system, not just authoritarian, but totalitarian. And he recognized, I think from early on, as he put it later, we can't go on like this. And he, therefore, step by step, he began to limit the power of the Communist Party to control everything from top down. And at the same time, he refused appeals to use force to prevent change, which had always been done before. Mm-hmm. So, and for the last 2 or 3 years of his presidency, his leadership, the country became remarkably open and so on. But at the same time, they developed very difficult economic problems because he was trying to change the economy to instead of a state-run economy, totally to bring in market elements and so on, but at the same time keep a socialist heritage. And I think that that ran into difficulties also as he began to take off the total control of the Communist Party and refusing to use the police state. It unleashed many of the tendencies, such as the non-Russian nationalism, so that these internal pressures were what eventually broke up the Soviet Union, despite his efforts.
So in the end, he didn't succeed because his own country disappeared. Could he have done better? Where did it go wrong? What could he have done differently so that the Soviet Union didn't disappear?
I think the only thing he could have done, this was a moving train. The possibilities in what was happening. These things were happening with extreme rapidity as these things go. And he was dealing with many different issues, very serious issues. But as we were reducing our tensions abroad, the internal problems were developing because, first of all, he had opposition within the party, resisting his attempts to, I would say, to free up the country. He brought to Russian history for the first time in its entire history relatively free elections. That was an immense achievement. And it was done in a way that actually a lot of the hardline communists were losing. He changed it from a one-party state to one that he was developing, if it had not developed, into a multi-party system and these various things. But everything did get out of hand because the economy tended to collapse. Now, what could he have done differently? Well, he could have used force. And if he had, it is very likely the country would have developed into a vicious civil war, given the things. And the fact that it didn't, that there was a largely peaceful change. That immense empire simply there was some violence, but it was comparatively minor as compared to what happens when other empires have imploded or been put down. So that I would say that the idea that somehow he made, of course, he made mistakes in many cases, particularly in his judgment of people at times, but none of us, frankly, those looking on, it was very hard to imagine how he was going to succeed in doing all these things. So that I would say that the only way that he could have preserved the system for a while would be to avoid changes in the rule and to keep the same totalitarian system that had brought about stagnation and so on. And of course, that was not his aim. I know that, Russians, many of them do not appreciate what he did. And they look at the difficult times that came later. But I would remind them it was not Gorbachev who broke up the Soviet Union. It was his rival, Boris Yeltsin, whom Gorbachev allowed to stay in politics, even when he was sort of expelled from the leadership, and allowed to run in the elections. Then it was later Yeltsin who, in effect, conspired with the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine to break up the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev at that time refused to stop this process using force at a time where he could have commanded that to be used. And I think he didn't do it because he was the first Russian leader, I believe, in history who refused to apply force to keep himself in power. Mm-hmm. I think that set a very important precedent, and one that most Russians simply don't recognize today. They went through very difficult times later, but it was not Gorbachev's fault, it was Yeltsin's. And the Russians themselves had elected Yeltsin, the leader. So their elected leader is the one who was the key element in bringing down the Soviet Union and breaking it up.
Thank you. But you already during Gorbachev's times, the economy didn't function very well. There were hard, miserable times during the Gorbachev years, and people came to the streets and protested. If Gorbachev had succeeded, then we would have a reformed Soviet Union, which would still continue to exist. Would that really be better than having the Soviet Union disintegrate and disappear, as we saw in 1991?
Well, obviously one can't predict all of the things that might have happened. It certainly seemed to many of us, including President Bush and many of us who were close to the situation, that that all except the three Baltic countries, whose independence we supported throughout. We never recognized they were legally part of the Soviet Union. We always pressed that they should be restored to their independence. But except for those three, we really thought it would be better. Inasmuch as Gorbachev was pushing for a voluntary federation, that it would be better for them to stay together. if you could get a more democratic and voluntary federation, it would be better for everybody. And that is precisely what President Bush told the Ukrainian parliament when he spoke to them then on August 1st, 1991.
Which was very criticized in the US.
Yes, and he said at that time he endorsed Gorbachev's Union Treaty and warned them to beware of suicidal nationalism. That was a very prophetic warning. Now, obviously, we had very little influence in what was happening at that point, but it is very clear that, at least to me, that there was a possibility there with large degree of autonomy in them and more bottom-up democracy that it would have been better for them not to break up into 12 separate countries, that is 12 other than the 3 Baltic states.
Thank you. Could the United States have done more to keep Gorbachev in power by, for example, which was mentioned at the time, offering a generous Marshall Plan for Gorbachev's new reformed Soviet Union? The Bush, for example, said we can't afford it, we don't want to do it. Was that a major mistake?
That's something we can debate. At the time, it seemed to me that they were having great problems with the breakdown of the centrally controlled economic system. And it was not simply a matter of throwing money at it. They didn't have the structure. So I said, this is not a case of a pump that needs priming. That may have been the case in Western Europe with the Marshall Plan, for example. But this time, the pump wasn't there. And throwing money at it may have been like pouring water on sand. However, I think we were not very creative in trying to think of ways that we could help. And I would mention that the former Prime Minister Thatcher came to visit Moscow in the spring of 1991. It was just a few months after she had been replaced as Prime Minister. And she visited and then asked the British ambassador to invite me to come, and because she had a message for President Bush. And she said that, you know, we must convince President Bush to start helping Gorbachev. I explained to her the difficulties there, what I've just said, and she looked at me and she said, "You are talking like a diplomat. Why can't you think like a statesman?" And, you know, she was probably right. There should have been ways if we had gotten involved earlier. But I would say in the Bush administration for a year or so, at the first of the Bush administration, they did not want to get involved in any cooperation to change the economic system. And then when Gorbachev began to ask for help, well, we were in something of a recession at home, and Bush felt that he was unable to take the lead in doing any financial help. So that I cannot say, you know, now that if we had been willing, we could have solved everything. Most unlikely. Mm-hmm. But these were very complex issues. And I would also point out that when we look at these individual issues, whether internal or external, that we had several absolutely, I would say, extremely important things happening all simultaneously. While the Soviet Union was beginning to come apart, we were negotiating some of the most important strategic arms agreements we were negotiating over the future of Europe, the unification of Germany. And the countries in Eastern Europe were going democratic and against the communists, but then we hadn't defined what their relationship would be with others. And internally, of course, the Soviet Union was going through all of the economic problems of the change. So it was remarkable the number of issues that he had to deal with simultaneously at that time. And as things began to be pressurized at home, I mean, he, in one case in January 1991, after there had been an attack on the television tower in Vilnius, Lithuania, one that Gorbachev did not order and did not authorize, President Bush sent a letter warning him that we would have to back off of some of our agreements to cooperate if violence continued in the Baltic countries. Mm-hmm. And I went in by myself to read the letter to him, and I read it in Russian translation. And, his answer to me, first of all, he asked me my assessment of the situation there. And I thought, he had some major problems, and I had told him, how I worried about some of the things that were happening then, particularly the growing violence in the Baltic area. And he listened to me, and then he said, please explain to your president that this country is on the brink of a civil war, and I must do everything I can to prevent that. And that means that my policy is going to have some zigs and zags. But this is like a sailboat that at times has to move in a direction different from its objective.
Thank you.
And then he said this was also another issue we were dealing at that time. This was just before the Gulf War, when we were trying to get Soviet support for resisting the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And Gorbachev had changed Soviet policy to either vote with us or sometimes abstain in the Security Council in order to let that go forward. And Gorbachev's final comment is, well, tell the president that if politics requires him to do some of these things, I'll understand, but let him know that I will carry out all of my agreements, meaning the international ones. The point was that we were dealing not with individual issues, big as they were, but with many international internal issues, very basic ones, all simultaneously.
Let me just ask you, how serious was Gorbachev in reducing nuclear weapons and the strategic threat, the nuclear threat between the West and the East? Was it done mostly for economic reasons, because he needed to lessen the arms race to save money, to save his own economy, and he then later wanted to obtain, of course, loans from the West, including from German Chancellor Kohl, who you can say that, and some scholars argue that Gorbachev's agreement to German unification was essentially bought by generous aid coming from the German Chancellor? Or was it a more genuine desire to come to an agreement with the Western countries?
I think that he obviously had economic reasons to want to reduce the defense budget. But the basic reasons we started reducing was because we were in a very dangerous situation. And both he and President Reagan were true believers in the necessity of eliminating nuclear weapons. They came very close to agreeing to do so. And they both hated the situation that we were confronting each other with nuclear weapons. And so there were very powerful reasons on both sides to try to reduce these. Now that gets very complicated over time because there were more than one issue involved. And but that is, we were able to solve the intermediate range, so-called INF, by eliminating them, and eliminating them with complete verification. That took years to negotiate, and Gorbachev for the first time allowed the sort of on-the-site verification, which previous Soviet leaders had not been willing to do. So now, obvious, but this was done because he saw the threat of nuclear war, and that became particularly clear to him, I think, after the Chernobyl disaster. These were, as I said, many of these things were going on at the same time, but we had started the whole effort to reduce nuclear weapons earlier, and as we were able to do that, it helped that these other things were being negotiated. At one point, when I was Director of Soviet Affairs in the State Department, we had counted 83 negotiations we had going with the Soviet Union in various areas, economic and other things. So this was an extremely complex process that involved many things. And when you isolate any one of them, you can say, well, why didn't this happen sooner, or why didn't that happen? But when you get right down to it, we started, you might say, thinking about negotiation with Gorbachev when he came in 1985, I believe. By 1989, we were negotiating almost the same negotiating strategy. We were solving virtually all the problems we had.
You were at the Reykjavik meeting, I understand.
But
how close did it come to the abolishing of nuclear weapons in East and West? Was that really on the agenda?
We came very close to an agreement to do so. Whether we could have carried it out is something else. But at the meeting in Reykjavik in October 1986, at one point when there was an agreement that they should agree to eliminate them, but then Gorbachev wanted Reagan to limit his strategic defense initiative more than Reagan was willing to. So somehow that eluded them. But in any event, that was something that both of them really wanted. And I know this in Reagan's case, because when Gorbachev had earlier proposed the elimination of nuclear weapons, and everybody in our bureaucracy said, oh, that's ridiculous, we can't do it. Reagan said, you're not going to criticize that. That's exactly what we should be doing. And we had, problems with some of the other things. But I think it was that issue more than any other that the two eventually were able to bond. And this is, so it is rather difficult when you go back and look at these various issues in the full context of how they took place, to say that, well, things would have been better if this happened or if that happened. We can't be sure, but I do know that by 1988, Gorbachev had already dropped the fundamental philosophy that had fueled the Cold War. Mm-hmm. That, as I mentioned before, the class struggle. And that was actually implicitly dropped in a speech to the United Nations on December 7th, 1988. And the thing is, and he said then there could be no limit on a country's choice of political system. And of course, he allowed that to happen in Eastern Europe, encouraged changes. So I was saying that, and of course, as Eastern Europe was being free, and then we got into the whole question of German unification and whether a united Germany would be allowed to stay in NATO. And this was going on at the same time that he was having the economic difficulties caused by changes that had to be made. If you were going to have a free economy, you had to start taking the state control out of a lot of things. But, you know, I have said that as far as the economy is concerned, it was as if they were trying to take a submarine and turn it into an airplane, keeping it operating all the time with the same crew. And if you can figure out how to do that, maybe you could have told us what we did wrong.
Thank you. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And a year later, Germany was united. And it took many, many months for Gorbachev to actually give his agreement to German unification within NATO. What made him in the end turn around and agree, despite Thatcher's and also Mitterrand's continuing skepticism? But in the end, Gorbachev gave his agreement, and that, of course, took the wind out of Thatcher's and also Mitterrand's counter-arguments. So what was decisive for him agreeing to German unification?
I think what was decisive for him was the recognition that it would be wrong for Russia to force the Germans apart, that the Germans should have a right to have their own state and unity. I think, and as far as geopolitics was concerned, I think he and some of his principal advisors, despite all of the passions brought on by the Second World War, understood that in the future, Soviet or Russian relations with Germany were going to be absolutely crucial to them. So that was, and I, you know, at the time, the year we were negotiating, I recall discussing this with one of the principal scholars, the head of their institute, MMO. And I said, well, are you going to continue to oppose German unification? And he said, well, first of all, we know it's going to happen now. They didn't for a while, but we know it's going to happen. And he said, you know, the British and the French are encouraging us to block it, but we can't do that because we cannot let our country be, you might say, the fall guy who prohibited German unity. So there was that. But there was also the feeling at first that, okay, the Germans can unite, but they're going to have to leave NATO. And the thing is that any of these, according to our agreements at the end of the Second World War, the victorious, the four powers that considered the victors, including the Soviet Union, had rights to approve any of these arrangements. They had, I believe, something like 300,000 troops stationed in East Germany. There was no way we were going to force them to take them out. But Gorbachev understood, I think also, that at a certain point, if there is unity and he leaves those troops there, and that if there are problems, he really could not really, or should not even consider using force. So in a sense, and it is true, as you suggested earlier, that he felt that that he was doing a considerable favor, and that West Germany should help finance his economic problems. They had no housing for those troops that were in Germany, and to bring them back, and then you might say take them out of the military, you're going to have a lot of very unhappy, unemployed families. These were complex issues. So yes, he pressed hard. And I know some of our allies felt that too. I know Margaret Thatcher would say, you know, Germany has to pay a lot of the costs. If they want, you know, their unity, fine, but they should be paying this because they can afford it, and the rest of us can't. Now,
and they did.
These were emotional issues for a lot of people.
Yeah. Thank you. Before we come perhaps to the present with the relations between Gorbachev and Putin, which are very interesting, let me ask you about the coup of August 1991, which of course eventually brought down Gorbachev. Did he not expect something like that to happen? Did he underestimate the consequences of his own reform program? Did he underestimate also Boris Yeltsin in the end? Or could he have prevented the coup if he had been more skillful, perhaps? How would you see that?
Well, he faced the possibility of a coup much earlier, and it was there all along. I think that if he made a mistake, it was placing too much trust in his own security organs. Although Khrushchev, who was by 1990 and 91 the chairman of the KGB, he had originally been a Gorbachev supporter, and Gorbachev had promoted him. But he and others began to be very much worried about the Soviet Union coming apart, so to speak, and wanted him to declare martial law. And he kept refusing. And this started back when, even in 1990, when the Lithuanians declared independence. And there was, I think, a real danger that if Gorbachev had approved that formally, he would have been removed in a coup. That was, many people thought that. Now, as it turned out, the very people who had organized without his participation the attack on the television counter in Vilnius were the ones that eventually tried to remove Gorbachev, who did the coup in August, which was really the cause eventually of the total breakup of the Soviet Union. That was one in which you ask, did we predict? I sent my first message to Washington in 1990, in June, I believe, that the Soviet Union could break up. I didn't predict that it necessarily would, but it could. And I think that I was probably the first in the US government that pointed out that possibility. Most people haven't thought about it. But the reason I pointed that out was, as I saw within the Russian Federation, the RSFSR, that there was a Russian nationalism developed that really wanted to shed the other republics. And they were talking about turning the Soviet Union into something like the EU. Now, without the support of Russians, given the fact that the other nationalities, many of them, were also beginning to pull away, you could say, my goodness, who's going to hold it together? So we were quite aware in our embassy, though I must say this was not the general view in the world as a whole, that he was walking on a very tight rope, and that he could be removed at any time. Those of us who were old timers remembered how Khrushchev had been removed when his reforms continued, and you knew that Gorbachev was running, in many cases, the same sort of threat. So that that was one issue. But as far as the actual coup that occurred in the summer of 1991, at a point when I had already announced that I would be leaving in about 6 weeks. I had been there 4.5 years, and they were great years professionally, but I thought it was time for me to leave and do something else. And the mayor of Moscow, who was one of the elected Democrats, they began to call them, with a little d, he called on me privately. I had invited him to lunch, and he had said, well, he couldn't come to lunch, but he'd like to pay a courtesy call. So when we sat in my study and discussed sort of local city politics, he wrote on a slip of paper that a coup is being prepared against Gorbachev, and he wanted to get word to Yeltsin. Yeltsin was in Washington at that time and was going to be seeing President Bush. And of course I said, okay, I'll send a message. But I didn't say it, I wrote it. And then I wrote in Russian, who is behind this? And then he wrote 4 surnames. And well, of course, these turned out later. 3 of them, 3 of the 4 were in the coup leaders, and the other had also been involved. So this turned out to be quite accurate. So I sent it to Washington, and President Bush told Yeltsin in the meeting, gave him that report, and asked Yeltsin what to do, and Yeltsin said, why don't you warn Gorbachev? So then I got a message on secure telephone that I should go and warn Gorbachev. And I said, look, I'll certainly go and tell him we have this report, but I don't believe I should name the people, because how could the American ambassador, without any real evidence that was independent of what the mayor had put down, tell the president that the head of his security organization, the head of his army, the speaker of his parliament, that people of that realm were conspiring against him. I said, we have no direct evidence of this. And he said, well, of course. So when I went into, then I got an immediate appointment, and I made my presentation by saying we have a report that we cannot confirm, but it is sufficiently serious that the president wanted to convey it to you. And then I said that the word is that there is a conspiracy underfoot that could take action at almost any time. And at first he chuckled a bit and turned to his assistant Chernyayev and said something about the naive Americans. And then he turned back and thanked me and said, oh, don't worry. I'm sure there's nothing to that. What your intelligence has probably picked up some, rumors. Well, I tried to disabuse him of that by repeating, as I said, we cannot confirm. I meant that to imply this is not an hard intelligence. We cannot confirm, but it is sufficiently serious that we thought it should be called to your attention. Well, then Bush was able to call him the next day. And when they were on the telephone, it was a line, and at that time the KGB controlled all of the secure communications. And Bush, when he said, "Did you see Matlock?" And Gorbachev said, "Yes, thank you for sending him in. I can tell you 1,000% there's nothing to that. And but thanks for sending him. We've said we were friends, and now you've proved it." And Bush said, "Well, I really wouldn't have bothered you, but Popov and Yeltsin thought you ought to know." Well, so he inadvertently named my source. Now, so that Gorbachev then actually, when Bush later came on a visit a few weeks later, Popov told me later that Gorbachev had actually shaken his finger at him when he came into a reception saying, "What are you doing telling these fairy tales to the Americans?" But then months later, after the coup occurred, failed, Soviet Union broke up, I asked Popov that he never told me who his source was. But he said, "How did it leak out that I had given you this information?" And I said, "Well, it was the president himself who named it on the telephone." And then to my surprise, Popov said, "Well, that was probably a good thing." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Khrushchev, of course, knew what was in that phone call, and he realized he had a leak. He had to stop all of his preparations. And that may well be why the coup failed." So this tells you, you might say, how unexpected things happen, how Murphy's Law has never been repealed.
But Gorbachev, if it's true that what he said, that he didn't believe that a coup was about to happen, was that genuine, or did he pretend it was not happening or couldn't happen?
No, I think he genuinely did not think that Khrushchev, who at one point had been one of his loyal supporters, was capable of organizing this. I think, he was proceeding, to proceed with the Union Treaty, and I think that he genuinely did not realize that some of the people who had been his friends were capable, in effect, of betraying him. Mm-hmm. But he did know that they were under pressure. They were certainly, many of them, advising him to declare martial law earlier, both regarding the Baltics and then in general, and when they started having strikes and so on. So that he was under that pressure. Yeah. But now he has never explained why. I can understand that at that time there were several members of parliament, a couple of lieutenant colonels, who were very outspoken about the need to remove Gorbachev. And he probably thought that, our intelligence was referring to those. Mm-hmm. As I said, although I tried to steer him away from thinking that I was giving him an intelligence report, in general, a report like that, the Russians will always think that, well, this must be their intelligence organization that has produced this. But in any event, I think that it did come as a surprise to him, a great surprise. And I think that it is clear that particularly the impact on Raisa Gorbachev's health. She came close to a nervous breakdown. So the later accusations that Khrushchev and others made, that Gorbachev had sort of encouraged that, I think are total lies.
Yes, and otherwise he probably wouldn't have gone to his dacha if he had had an inkling what was in the pipeline. Thank you for this very interesting episode. Before we come to the Q&A in a few minutes' time, let me ask you about the relationship between Gorbachev and Putin. That was a very strange relationship. Partially, Gorbachev seemed to be supportive of Putin. Partially, he seems to have been highly critical of Putin. But Gorbachev did approve of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So he was on the side of Putin in this instance, at least. Do you have deeper insights from your conversations with Gorbachev, how he viewed the Putin regime in Moscow, and also how he saw these recent developments since February of this year, the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, here again, this depended on the time and the issue. Just after Yeltsin named Putin sort of acting president, I had a meeting with Gorbachev. It was when I was doing interviews connected with the book I wrote on Reagan and Gorbachev. And when I came in, he started talking about contemporary politics. I didn't even ask him. Yeltsin had named this fellow Putin. And I remember he said, this guy is a mystery. He's a black box. He has no experience. You know, what can we expect? And obviously, not at all. However, when Putin took charge, the attitude of the government toward Gorbachev changed radically. For example, when Gorbachev had traveled abroad in the United States and elsewhere, as long as Yeltsin was president, he was never received by Russian ambassadors, was never entertained there. And as a matter of fact, the feeling, among diplomats was that Gorbachev had to be avoided if you wanted to be, a friend with Yeltsin. But as soon as Putin became in charge, first as acting president, and then he was elected president, the Soviet embassies began to have Gorbachev stay with them to sponsor functions and so on. So the government started treating Gorbachev more decently, like a former president, once Yeltsin was no longer president. And either that or because, when Putin came in, Russia was totally bankrupt. And Putin did have a reputation of someone who could get things done in a system that things didn't get done very much. So that within a couple of years, I know that Gorbachev was in New York, and in a meeting with the Council on Foreign Relations, he was asked about Putin. This was early on. And his answer then was, well, the country is in a real mess, but it looks as if he is starting to deal with some of it, and maybe he can. He said it's going to be very difficult. Now, later, I think he was also very critical and when Putin began to restrict the rights of Russians, and when you began to get the suppression of dissent and so on, he was highly critical of those. He supported a publication that was criticized many of these things. Now, when it came to, now you mentioned that he didn't criticize taking Crimea. Well, of course, he never really approved the breakup of the Soviet Union. He thought that was a great mistake, and he blamed, of course, Yeltsin for that. And in particular, I don't think any Russian would have approved of letting Crimea be in a country which became a member of NATO. That's one of their principal naval bases. And the fact that Yeltsin had let Ukraine have Crimea, despite history, was certainly something Gorbachev would never approve of. And it was done peacefully. Yeltsin, of course, Putin followed procedures that the United States had followed in separating Kosovo from Serbia. And they did it without any casualties. And one can say that it was very clear that Crimea, which under the Soviets had a autonomous status, once the Ukraine became independent and it was part of Ukraine, the Ukrainians tried to eliminate the autonomous status. The people never were given a chance to vote as to whether they preferred to be in Ukraine or Russia, even though up until Khrushchev's time, they had been part of Russia. So these are very complex issues. And in this case, obviously, Putin was moving for strategic reasons. If there had not been any possibility of NATO moving in, of Ukraine becoming part of NATO, I think he would never have taken Crimea. But that's why he did. And I think that it was rather hard for Gorbachev to criticize that when he thought it was a huge mistake in the first place to break up the Soviet Union, and in particular, if it was going to break up, for Russia to approve Crimea, as part of Ukraine.
Was Gorbachev
right that he didn't publicly criticize that, but he did publicly criticize Putin for many things, and particularly all of the domestic crackdowns.
Thank you. What about the invasion and the attack on Ukraine? How did Gorbachev see that?
I'm sorry?
The recent attack on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Russia is waging. How did Gorbachev see that? How did he comment on that?
I'm not sure he made a public statement. He could not have approved it. I mean, he was against using force, these things. But I'm not aware. One thing, he was extremely ill, as I pointed out. He's been ill for about 2 years. And
no, I understand. Thank you. Let me ask you, how did Gorbachev reconcile
the statement? I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
But I can understand why at that point his health was such he was probably not making any public statements.
In a minute, we come to our questions from the audience. Just a final question. How did Gorbachev reconcile the fact that he is a hero in the United States, a hero in Europe, particularly in Germany, and he's vilified in his own country in Russia? Did that depress him? How did he see that? It must not have been very pleasant for him.
He was aware of it and thought it was quite unfair. You know, he said in his, you might say, concession speech, when he said that he was ceasing his function as president of the Soviet Union, he described how they had turned a totally totalitarian dictatorial system into one that now had elections and processes. And I think that is the point. It's a great achievement. Now, it was not Gorbachev who broke up the Soviet Union, it was Yeltsin. And Yeltsin was elected by the people in the Russian Federation as their leader. So if the Russians don't like the fact that it was broken up, they shouldn't be blaming Gorbachev. And they certainly, most of them, should remember. And I think very, very few would want to go back to conditions that the economic conditions that were in the Soviet Union before Gorbachev took office. So the thing is, I think that there is a great unfairness in what they look at it, the situation. they owe him a lot. And it was their own votes that brought about the situation that broke up the Soviet Union. And I don't think that was totally inevitable. But on the other hand, who knows what would have happened otherwise? As we mentioned before, it's, many of us at the time thought that everybody would be better off if there could be a democratizing voluntary federation. And certainly it would have been easier to deal with the economic problems if you didn't suddenly have the barriers between the various republics when during the Soviet Union and during the Russian Empire earlier, most economic development tied them all together. And I think there were a lot of reasons that in general, but everybody wanted to get rid of communism, and getting rid of the communism seemed to me getting rid of the Soviet Union. So they didn't really try the other option, that is to let the Soviet Union evolve into an increasingly democratic state with an economy which developed on market basis with private property and these other things. The problem is none of these huge changes can occur overnight. And I think that people look at a number of the conditions which were probably inevitable given the circumstances of what they were trying to change, and they blame it on Gorbachev rather than those who at that time were in charge, like Yeltsin, for example.
Thank you very much indeed. Some of what you said, I think, is controversial. Some people will not agree at all with what you say. Some people will wholeheartedly agree with you and think you make a lot of sense. Let's turn to our audience and turn to our two Krasno assistants who may have some questions from the audience. If you haven't yet written in, if you want to ask Ambassador Matlock a question or agree with him, express your views, then please, if you're a member of the audience, submit a question and write it in via the chat function of your Zoom screen. Willow, would you like to ask the first question to Ambassador Matlock?
Certainly, thank you so much. We have a question from John McKay in Cincinnati. So Gorbachev sought financial help from the Bush administration and later from the Group of Seven, but was turned down. Do you see this as a missed opportunity to keep Gorbachev in power?
I didn't hear the first phrase.
Gorbachev sought financial help from the Bush administration.
Oh, he sought
and later.
help. Yes.
Yeah.
You know, the problem there was that, as I said, the system had started reforming, but it was not yet reformed. And I think that we should have been, the United States and our West European allies should have been more helpful earlier. In the beginning of the Bush administration, one of my recommendations had been to get involved in trying to advise and assist the transition to a market economy. And the Bush administration and Secretary of State Baker turned that down, thinking that, well, Gorbachev and the Soviets just want in these international economic organizations in order to sabotage them. I think that was no longer the case, and I think it was a mistake for us to keep aloof from the initial attempts to begin to deal with the problems of transition. I thought at the time we and East Europeans who were also dealing with this, but they had more experience with a non-communist economy than the Russians because they'd been subjected to the communist system a shorter period. I thought that we should encourage sort of general cooperation in dealing with the transition. But we didn't do that. We didn't come in until it was a question, I think, of aid. It is one that Margaret Thatcher, for example, the British Prime Minister was in favor of large aid, thinking particularly from the United States and Germany. So there were others who obviously thought that we should be helping more. But the problem by 1991 was that as yet they had not yet converted the system from the old command system to something that worked as a market economy. And just throwing money at that wouldn't have been sufficient. So I think that we probably perhaps missed a chance to be involved earlier and helping with the planning and easing out some of the hard bumps that might have worked. Who knows?
Thank you. The questioner, John McNay, fully agrees with your answer. He just writes in, which is nice. Jess, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, of course. This question comes from Scott Schwartz, and he asks, during Gorbachev's administration, how much effort or information did he release in regards to Stalin's administration to the Russian people? This is from Andover, Massachusetts.
Your voice is breaking up.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I did not understand.
Can you repeat it?
Yes, this question comes from Scott Schwartz, and he asks, during Gorbachev's administration, how much effort or information did he release in regards to Stalin's administration to the Russian people?
How much did Gorbachev release of information about Stalin?
I think yes, under pressure, he allowed the information as a rule to come forward. Once they had elections and Congress of People's Deputies, one of the first questions was raised was whether there had been a Nazi-Soviet pact back in 1939, because the Soviets had never admitted that there was a secret protocol to the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So one of the first questions raised, and they set up a committee to investigate this. Now, this committee could not find the Russian copy of that, but they concluded on basis of other evidence that it had existed. Actually, all the West had was a photocopy that had been secreted in Germany during the war. But they found enough evidence and they reported that, yes, it had existed. So he allowed that to go forward. Now, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the copy of the treaty was in fact found and in the archives held by the General Secretary. And the question is, did he know that? I suspect he did not. After all, he was not one to be able to go down and know what was in the full archive. Most of us thought that after the German invasion, that Stalin would have had it destroyed, but apparently he didn't. But I would say in this case, Gorbachev didn't produce the evidence, probably because he didn't know it was there, but he allowed the process to go forward, and the conclusion of those investigating it was that, yes, it had existed. And it was declared invalid ob novo, that is, invalid from the very beginning.
Thank you. I think one of the Soviet leaders, one of his predecessors, who he was influenced most by was Khrushchev. And for example, his 1956 de-Stalinization speech. How important was Khrushchev's influence on Gorbachev?
Gorbachev was quite aware of what happened to Khrushchev. And he, I think, at least initially, he took some measures to avoid facing that. But eventually, of course, there was the effort, as there had been, to oust him. However, he was maneuvering to avoid that. That's why he proposed establishing a presidency. They had never had a presidency before. And to, in effect, replace the party Politburo with a state council of people whom he named. So he began to set up, I would say, change the institution in a way that would avoid the being controlled by the Politburo, as had been the case earlier. Obviously, in the final analysis, it didn't succeed, though it has succeeded probably for about 2 years, putting off what easily could have happened earlier.
Thank you. Khrushchev, of course, in retirement, when he was pushed out, was put under severe house arrest. That didn't happen to Gorbachev. So was Gorbachev, did he tell himself he was lucky that he had a much better retirement age?
Well, I'm not sure. The thing is, Yeltsin had agreed that he would have an institute and a number of other things. And then when Gorbachev criticized some things he did, Yeltsin would take back some of these things that had been given him. But there was one thing very clear, that Gorbachev did not use his position to set aside riches or expensive places to live. And so that, in that sense, he was sort of a typical communist leader. He used what the state, offered him, and most party leaders lived better than ordinary people, but they didn't become rich in and of themselves. And so he was not at all like the leaders that succeeded him, who piled up, in many cases, millions under their personal control.
Thank you very much. Willow, do we have another question?
We do. We have a question from Scott Schwartz. How did Gorbachev feel about the Chinese? Did he feel that they were neighbors that he could trust?
That again is something of a moving train. Gorbachev, his predecessors, the Soviet Union and China had come close, had actually had clashes on the border, and had at times come close to war under Khrushchev and earlier. I think that Gorbachev was trying really to improve relations. And that's one of the reasons he didn't publicly criticize the suppression of the students on Tiananmen Square. And he also was trying to improve relations with Japan. In general, I think he wanted the best possible relations with everybody. But the tensions with China had been much higher earlier, and they were gradually dissipated under Gorbachev.
Thank you. Let me encourage our audience to ask a couple of more questions, because we have a few minutes time, but I would like to ask Ambassador Matlock whether he views Gorbachev as a tragic figure, full of promise, full of vigor and energy, but in the end, he does not succeed with his grand objectives. Or is that a wrong interpretation of the man's long
I think it concentrates on only one side of what he did. And as I sometimes, thinking for an analogy, I would say, Moses is credited for taking his people out of bondage. He is not criticized that he didn't reach the promised land. Think about that. And the thing is, the Soviet system could not easily been changed bottom up. It was so that the person in charge had so much power that at any point, if things seemed to be getting out of town, if he, and it was always a he, wanted to stay in power, he had plenty of power to suppress them. Gorbachev didn't. Instead, he methodically took the power out of the hands of the party. And that he didn't really have to do that. And the only reason he did it was the idealistic reason that this country isn't getting anywhere. He would often say privately to us that, this is a country which has always been ruled top down. If we look out at the world and other countries, the successful ones are ruled bottom up. My task is reversing the tendency of Russian history. And then he would add, but I can't do it overnight because Russia has no experience with bottom-up governing. It's going to have to come in stages. Well, it didn't come fast enough. And on the other hand, when one looks at the problems of how, as I said, how you convert a submarine to an airplane, keep it operating, and keep the same crew on board, which is in effect what they were trying to do to that economy. How do you do it? Well, actually, it's only going to happen if the old system collapses. And until you can build a new one, which doesn't happen overnight, you're going to have chaos and a lot of suffering. Mm-hmm. Is there any other option? I don't think there is. And so I think he gets credit, should get a lot, first of all, for negotiating an end to the Cold War under terms which were quite favorable to everybody. The axiom that they lost the Cold War is crazy. After all, we all gained from the end of the Cold War. And then the conversion of the Soviet Union to a democratic, free economy, a market economy, when it had been almost the opposite, was something that probably was going to take a generation or two, and not simply a simple leader. And he has been succeeded by people who have not been willing ultimately to follow the democratic route anymore, and who are, unlike him, willing to apply force, which is an old Russian tradition. So we're still getting an effort to solidify the top down rather than the bottom up. And that's the opposite of what he was trying to achieve.
Thank you very much indeed. I see a question by Mark Kramer of the Davis Center of Harvard University. Jess, would you like to ask that question or summarize it?
Sure, just give me one moment. So by late 1987, and especially 1988, before the elections to Congress, the Stalin era repressions became a subject of intense interest in the USSR. This made it possible for publications, This made it possible for publications like many others.
I was just talking about the freedom to publish, or I'm not sure what the question
No,
is.
no, there were many publications coming out about the purges, about Stalinist gulags, about
Oh, yes.
Stalin's
The
mass
opening up of
deportation. Yep.
de-Stalinization. Yes, he revived that. You know, the first criticism of Stalin had occurred with Khrushchev, but then they began to backtrack and have many others. But Gorbachev allowed a real campaign of exposing Stalin's crimes. So that was a step-by-step thing, but certainly by 1989, 1990, there was almost total freedom in the press to investigate Stalin's crimes and the other things and to discuss them.
Yes.
In fact, I would say by 91, the Soviet press and media in general, though they were still state-owned, state-controlled, were freer than they have ever been before or since.
Yeah, thank you. And Soviet archives became accessible, which was also a new thing. And we still benefit from that because many photocopies were taken, many photos taken, which are still available in the Western world for researchers to use. There are a couple of other questions. Willow, would you ask the next question?
Definitely.
And Matlock, can you bear with us for a few more minutes because we'll have a few more questions here.
No, a few.
Give it another 7-8 minutes at max, and then we'll finish the session.
All right.
Thank you.
We have a question from Don Van Atta. He asks, could you comment on how Gorbachev emerged as a leader, especially given his apparent patrons Andropov and Kulakov?
How did he emerge as a leader?
Yes.
You know, first of all, he climbed you might say, the ladder in leadership by, I think, one being unusually diligent and carrying out what he was doing and seeming quite loyal to the people above, and among a number of the, you might say, second-level Soviet officials, he was one who was relatively efficient, and in effect, you know, he was able to curry favor with some of the top people at the time. He was in charge of a province where a lot of them came for their vacation in the south, there at Krasno. So that I think he was brought in by mainly by Andropov, who understood that the system needed some changes. Now he was interested in only very limited changes, but there was a general recognition that things weren't working well. And Gorbachev was brought to Moscow along with Ryzhkov, who was his prime minister for several years, with the orders to secretly to make some reform plans. And they talked about this later after they were in power. And then finally, the old generation, after Brezhnev and then Andropov and then Chernenko, they were all ill, dying off. You know, at one point, Reagan was accused of not meeting the Soviet leaders. And he said, well, you know, they keep dying on me. And so I think the country was really desperate for someone who would take charge and who was younger. And Gorbachev, you know, seemed to fit that. And I think he got the support of Gromyko. Gromyko, the longtime foreign minister, probably would have liked to be number one himself. But when he realized he didn't have the votes, I think he thought he could sort of help make Gorbachev to be the kingmaker So he supported Gorbachev's election as general secretary. So that, but for us in the West, it was clear that this was a very efficient young man and who did not have many of the faults of the older generation. He was also much better educated than they had been. But in any event, he rose to the top, basically having great loyalty to the system, but with a growing recognition that the system needed to change.
Thank you very much. There's one final question about the Chernobyl disaster. How shocked was Gorbachev by that? Did that really shock him to the bones?
He was very much shocked.
Yeah.
And it taught him, I think, a lot about the inefficiency within the party. And this is one of the reasons he began to take the party out of control of the economy. It was the shock of Chernobyl and the way it helped. But it was a shock not only for Gorbachev, but also for their military. I heard General Yazov say in private several times, never in public, that until Chernobyl, he had thought if there should be a nuclear war, the Soviet Union could prevail. And then he said, with Chernobyl, it was absolutely clear no one could win a nuclear war. And as a matter of fact, you don't even have to use nuclear weapons because you can bomb a nuclear power plant and disable the whole province. And, so I think it taught also the Soviet military that, the strategy of thinking that at some point, if you're pushed hard enough, you could use nuclear weapons. Suddenly you begin to realize, no.
Thank you very much.
Cannot be won and must never be fought. And that was the first thing that Reagan and Gorbachev were able to agree on.
Thank you. Let's hope that Putin and the rest of the world keeps that in mind as well. Ambassador Jack Matlock, has been a great pleasure. You enlightened us about Gorbachev, the person, Gorbachev's legacy, Gorbachev's politics, his achievements, his huge achievements, but also his failures and what he didn't achieve. It has been a pleasure. We have really been enlightened, and I hope that you will be back sometime soon.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much for coming. And I would like to tell our audience that the next Krasno event is already tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. And we will talk about US-China relations and the Taiwan question. So another hot topic. I hope you will tune in. You can use the same Zoom link as for today. And we should also have, a very exciting event with 3 panelists tomorrow: China, US, and the Taiwan question. But thanks again, Ambassador Jack Matlock. It has been a great pleasure. And thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. And good night. And you will soon be able to watch the video on our YouTube channel. Bye-bye for now.